My name is Hugh, H-U-G-H, Lifson, L-I-F-S-O-N, and I understand you wanted to know something about my background. Well, I grew up in New York City in a fairly wealthy Jewish intelligentsia environment. So I'm out here. Once upon a time it was culture shock, but I really like being out here. Home is where the bread is, so that's why I was here at a job at Cornell College. So that's kind of my background. I studied all over the place. I studied with an individual artist in his atelier in Provincetown, Massachusetts, and then in the wintertime as well. And then at Wesleyan University. Well, I did a year at Wisconsin, then Wesleyan University. Then I went off to Indiana University to start my MFA, and then transferred to Pratt Institute to complete my MFA. And at that particular time, Pratt Institute was one of the main bastions of abstract expressionism. And my tradition, or my experience before that, was very much as a realist painter. And so, the particular teacher, a man by the name of Robert Richenberg, was extremely persuasive. And he told me very, very cogent reasons why I should be switching my style. So that's it in a nutshell. The name of the show is CHELM and TZFAT. CHELM is a small town, both mythical and real, in Poland, actually populated by what are known as wise fools. These were, this is like the Ole Lena story, except it's in the Jewish tradition. Young man comes to the rabbi and says, I don't understand it. My wife just gave birth to a baby and we've been married for 3 months. So in Jewish tradition, you answer a question with a question. So what's the problem? You've been married for 3 months, your wife's been married for 3 months, and you've both been married for 3 months. So I don't see any problem. Or, for example, man comes to the rabbi and says, which is more important, the sun or the moon? And the rabbi says, don't you know? The moon is more important because when the sun's shining, it's light out anyway. And so forth and so on. So this has been an endearing source of wit and my culture at its best. My father was a writer of Yiddish theater and also a scholar on the history of the Yiddish theater. So this particular kind of Yiddishkeit, as it's called, a Jewish culture, has been important to me throughout my life. It's only recently gotten into my work, which is an interesting story in itself. TZFAT is these two towns don't relate to each other at all, really. TZFAT is a town in northern Israel, which was founded in the late 15th, early 16th century by Sephardic, that is to say Spanish Jews, escaping from the Reconquistador when Ferdinand and Isabella kicked out the Jews and others from Spain. Most of them went to Turkey, but a whole bunch of them went back to whatever it was called then, Canaan, the Holy Land, whatever it was called, and found a city, which has now become the center of Jewish mysticism and which has inspired a great deal of painting, none of which has to do with my work. But I've been interested in architecture practically throughout my mature period in making art. And the architecture of that town with its kind of cavern entryways, with their what is known as bimot, that is to say the altars, which are actually scaffoldings that you climb up to read the Torah, really kind of fascinated me. And so that's why these two towns are displayed here, so to speak. I should mention that the TZFAT pieces are accompanied in some of these paintings by the Spanish origins. For example, Cordoba and TZFAT, or Avila and TZFAT. This is where there was a large Sephardic Jewish population in Spain, which did the emigrating to to Israel, what now is Israel. Yeah, my paintings were fairly representational, and although I was one of the first people to start using acrylic back in the in kind of the mid-late 50s, it wasn't very popular, it wasn't really used at all. But I've always been concerned with transparencies. Even when I was painting with oil, it would be glazes like traditional Renaissance artists. So that's been a factor. One day I was sitting around the faculty area at the student commons in Cornell, and somebody, at that time a lot of people smoked, somebody took a piece of cellophane and put it over this actual very disgusting ashtray, which had cigarette butts and gum and who knows what all, and it transformed it. It totally transformed it. Now there's an interesting Platonic dialogue which kind of refers. Hippias is running across the agora, and Socrates stops him and says, "I say, tell me what is beauty?" And Hippias is in a hurry, so he dismisses. "Oh, gold is what's beautiful. You put gold on anything, it turns it beautiful." So Socrates says, "Oh, even a chamber pot?" Well, as modern artists, that would have been a legitimate answer, but not for Hippias. Well, the problem with Hippias' answer was that he should have said plastic wrap instead of gold, I think. So that would have made a big difference, but in terms of my work. Well, there were some other influences. I wanted to use a modern artifact. This was the time of the Vietnam War. This was late 60s. And the idea that I could use a material that was being used for napalm and transform it into something that was valid and beautiful was a challenge to me. There was also the fact that at that time I was very much interested in mainly 14th but also 15th century faience tiles from Persia, Iran actually, and the kind of oscillation that takes place. And op art was an important movement at that time. So that factored in. And there was an intimate reason as well. I have had a skin disease, the treatment of which is, or can be, wrapping oneself in plastic wrap. So as I say, there was this kind of intimate relationship with this stuff. But I would say it's continued to be important to me because of the transparency that I can use. People say, well, why do you use plastic wrap? And I say, because the painting tells me to use it. And again, I can. So that's it in a nutshell. There's more to the story, but that's basically it. As I said, I do preparatory drawings, but I want them to be valid works of art. These are culled from hundreds that I did in the past year or so. Because, as I say, I do a lot of preparatory drawings. These are those, and also finished works of art. The watercolors, I'm not quite sure how it came about, but I really became enamored of watercolors. In fact, I'm kind of a schizophrenic. I actually pretend I'm a 19th century artist and go out and do plein air watercolors as well, just because I enjoy doing them. They're not making a very profound statement. But again, the notion of transparency has really been in my work back in my student days. There's a tilt, absolutely. And I picked that up as a student. Yeah. And no question about it. And it often is very surprising. I mean, it's one of the reasons one paints. There are conceptual artists. There's an artist who has a lot of work done in Davenport by the name of Saul Lewitt, who argued that anytime you deviate from the original concept, it's an unacceptable compromise. For me, that's a lot of hooey, because if I were simply working off a theme, what the hell's the point? It's all done. So I like to be surprised. I used to tell my students this. They might be working on a landscape, and I'd say, well, that barn there really has to be more intense. And the student would say to me, but it's not that way. And I would say, look, when that watercolor, whatever it is hanging in the Louvre, nobody's going to care. So the art has its own valid raison d'etre, which has nothing to do with realism. Now there is the ultra-realist movement, and that they get very close, but I'm not involved with that. I also used to do a lot of nude studies. There's so much one can learn from the human figure, aside from the emotional relationship, just in terms of form and proportion. I studied, one of the artists I studied with, a woman by the name of Mercedes Matter, who just recently had a show at the Davenport Museum, was involved in a kind of proportional relationship that goes back to the Greeks and to Michelangelo. And you can learn so much about proportion. And in these paintings, as abstract they are, proportion is terribly important. What should be the size of this image and this part of the painting in relationship to something else? So proportion is a constant. If it's not a constant preoccupation for the artist, I'm not quite sure how they get away with it. So working from the nude is one of the best ways, because you have a way of checking. In other words, if the elbow is way over here and it should be here, you can kind of double check. So working from the nude is terribly, terribly important. I haven't been doing it lately, but I had persisted in doing it for a long time. Giorgio Morandi, in some ways, is the premier painter's painter. He can take the most subtle shapes and make magic out of them. He painted for the last 40 years. He painted the same bottles. To find that much richness is amazing. Another artist who, by the way, fits into that same category is a man by the name of Bernard Chea, contemporary, well, he just died recently, who used to go back to Rockport, Massachusetts every year and paint the same pile of rocks every year, and each one's more beautiful than the next. I don't think, and I tell this to my students, I don't think you can avoid Cezanne. You can't go around him. You have to go through him. In terms of, obviously before Cezanne, you couldn't do that. I mentioned Titian. There would be other artists who, in terms of glazing techniques and transparency, from the Renaissance on, people like Mazza di Banco, who painted in fresco but still had that kind of glowy quality. Manet has always been important to me. And as a matter of fact, I discovered in Manet raw umber. I never really knew its potential until I looked. There's a painting of Manet at the Metropolitan Museum of Art called Boy with Sword. And the painting's made up to these series of browns, and all of a sudden turquoise right in the middle of the painting. What's going on here? How did he get away with it? Well, it turns out that the richness of the brown can carry it, can support it. Two of the Iowa artists who taught here, Jim Lachey, whom I knew quite well, I knew his family. His daughter was my first love. Never wasted a brushstroke. He would stand in front of his paintings and wait and wait and wait. Then he would put it down. His paintings are the acme of economy. I mean, that's something to respect. I don't think I fit into that category, but I aspire to it. Philip Guston, who is, various style, everything he did, everything he touched was very, very rich. Of the abstract expressionists, Adolf Gottlieb is one that is not talked about very much. But Adolf Gottlieb, first of all, in his burst paintings, he's able to put this one form virtually in the center of his paintings and be sensitive to the negative spaces, the supporting spaces around it, so that they're enough and they can support this form, which is kind of a miracle. I must say, when I talk to my students, the first thing I would look at is the negative spaces. First thing I would look at, positive spaces. In one sense, they don't take care of themselves. That's kind of almost less important. That's one of the reasons that Morandi's so important, because the spaces between the bottles are so crucial. So there's a bunch anyway. Yes, I tend to be self-analytical, but I think I was kind of be more. I thought I believed I owed it to my students to tell them why and wherefore I was making statements. You know, not just I like this or not like that, or doing when I had one teacher who was terrible. She'd come over to look at your work and say, now what do you think? And you'd say something, and then she'd say, oh, yeah, that's right, and then on to the next. No, it's irresponsible. So certainly in the analytical sense, it was terribly important. In the emotional sense, it's very interesting about that. We're privileged characters, professors. And of course, we have the summer off to do our own work at our own pace. Come September, oh my God, I'm back in harness. And then I meet the students, and they would be infectious. Suddenly their enthusiasm and mixed with mine and so forth become very, very exciting in ways that I hadn't expected. So there are some reasons why I enjoy teaching. Yes.